Hello everyone and welcome to the 2023 Photo Contest Architecture category. So we're going to jump right in here. These are, again, just like yesterday, dropped in a random order. Put everybody's name in the bottom and then a link for the honorable mentions as well as second and first place. This was a category you guys really did not struggle with too much. The floor and ceiling here, high floor, really high ceiling. So I love architectural photography. It's one of my favorite types of photo when they're done well. And so I look through here and I found something to enjoy in every single photo you guys submitted. So we're going to start with Francesco Coppola and his photo of I assume a model in front of the IBM, either a model or he is the world's greatest gigolo. So we have the model in front of the IBM building. So let's take a look at a couple of things that are going really well here. There is a really great juxtaposition between straight line and curving line. So you've got the model, and her pose and her form give her a lot of curve. And then you've got the building, which is horizontal straight lines, vertical straight lines. And so that sets the model apart from the building. It also the difference in the model's dress versus the color of the building also sets her in front of it, very well in front of it. So I think that there's a lot of really good instinct going on in this photo in that regard. Some things that I would look at revising in this. Real quick one, grab the clone brush, take the signs off the doors because they break up the dark rectangular shape of the door and become a distracting element. Grab your crop, take this down to 4x5 and take the IBM off the left side of it. And so if you imagine then this being cropped at the vertical of the left door that has the sticker on it, and then going north from there, then I think that would make the model more of the subject of the photo. And we're going to talk about this, by the way, less as an architecture photo, more as a model shoot, because realistically, the building is not the subject of the photo. And then the last thing is, this is best guess, like a 35 to 50 millimeter lens used for this shot. And if you look at the model, she's out of focus. So focus was missed a little bit. The plane of sharpest focus, if you look at the pavement behind her, starts, we're going to guess, 3.5 feet behind her feet. So this is my best guess here is that when you sighted up the photo in the viewfinder, she was in focus. And then you just leaned a little bit forward when you took the photo, right? Or, no, went the wrong way. Leaned a little bit back. Did I? No. Anyway, you leaned a little bit one direction. It's late and I'm trying to figure it out on the fly. Anyway, you leaned a little bit one direction, and if you think about when you focus a lens manually, if you have that lens element move in, depending on where you are in the focus scale and the lens focal length, if it moves out 1 millimeter, you could focus from infinity feet down to 50 feet, or you could focus from 3 feet down to 2 feet. So with this, Francesco is a little bit far away from the model, probably in the 25 to 30 foot, 20 to 25 foot range, which means a focus shift of having the lens move 1.5 millimeters in either direction is going to completely throw off focus. And that's what happened here. So I know it's going to sound kind of like a ridiculous thing to say, but a couple of ways to do that would be have burst mode. If your camera has burst mode, shoot a burst and then one of them would nail focus. The other thing would be to check or to have a monopod or tripod with you that you could use, or even if there's like a railing there, then just have the camera resting on that. It does look like the camera is centered on her hip, which means I'm going to guess, Francesco, that either you were hand holding it with a waist level viewfinder or kneeling, and both of those are poses which can be prone to a little bit of sway when you actually go to take the photo. So the number of things that are going right here in terms of like the juxtaposition of tone and texture, I think those things are really good instincts with this photo. Next up, we have a photo from Harrison Fisher, which is violently film. Like, I looked at this and the first thing was like, yeah, that's a film photo. And the scratches, the dust, which make it look like this was probably an expired film, came back with a very thin negative, and then this was recovered digitally, add a whole lot to this photo because of how smooth that bridge is, and because of how even the lighting is from the clouds, and how the reflection of that recently rained on bridge makes all of that seem even smoother. So you now have this smoothness of the bridge with the texture that's inherent to the negative itself, and the evenness of the lighting on the bridge, and the unevenness of the lighting in the bottom right corner and the bottom left, where some of the darkness of the shadows was lost because of the thinness of the negative, and then the grain of the photo adds a lot of pleasing texture to the structure of the image as well. So I think this really worked well from a demonstration of how a film photo can use the film as a medium to emphasize the subject and the medium at the same time. Next up from Alexa D, we have a detail shot, an architectural detail shot. So this photo is one that I looked at and I really enjoyed this a lot. I enjoy architectural detail photos. I think that taking a photo of a part of a building and having it convey the sense of the whole building can be really, really hard. This does that very well because of the flourishes here. We have the doors, so clearly this was used as an entry at some point. We have the brick structure. We have the sort of like crown or keystone shape of the brick up at the top. We have the cement surround. So there's a lot of different shapes and textures. We have and colors also. We have all of this red and then this bright white thing and this black circle and this gray square with the grates, or the louvers rather. So there's a real, and also you can tell by the way, the bottom here, you have a little bit of shadow. So there's some depth to this as well. So there's a whole lot going on here that we can tell with texture, shape, color, tone, depth in just this one little detail that tells us that this was some industrial type building. And this was probably at one point a railway unloading door where the doors would open up and the rail cars would come in on the second level and then they'd unload whatever was being unloaded. And it goes back a while because of the architectural flourish, probably 1920s, 1910s, 1920s, best guess, because of the vertical brick structure there. That's the sort of thing that stopped being done as cost became more imperative in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So anyway, the point of all that is that this one little detail about this building tells us a whole lot about it and tells us a lot of the story of it. And then things like this crack in the bricks tells us the building has been through a lot. So this photo is giving us a nice story about the building without making that story super obvious. And I think it really was executed very well in that regard. Almost edged into an honorable mention, but I think when you see the top 5 photos in this category, everyone will understand that this category was really dominated by some strong work. So here we have a distance shot from Andrej Bjelakovic, and that's a very European scene, like super, super European. We've got a nice, shiny, relatively newish building juxtaposed. I keep using that word. I probably need to think of a better one. Sitting next to this really old, maybe not really old, but let's say probably Eastern Bloc, 50s, 60s, 70s era apartment building. And I think it's really neat looking at these two buildings next to each other because you have this smooth encased glass structure that's really shiny and lit from inside, and then a very brick or concrete, actually very concrete building that is pretty dark. So compared to the sky in the other building, it's a really good instinct to look at those two things and put them together in a photo. So let's imagine a little bit of a revision here. If you could even just try cropping this, right? Crop it so that you take off the building on the right, which is going to give you a line that goes down to about that that left-sided stoplight in the background, and then cut over to the left, and then just a little bit above that stoplight. And what would happen is then you would have this foreground building, and you'd lose a little bit. You'd lose the traffic in the bottom. That's a bit of a distracting element, and then the signs, which are a distracting element, and then the photo would become just about that old building and the new building, and showing the difference that progress over the last half century, give or take, has had in this city. So I think the instinct is there, and it's a really good way to show the differences between the old way of life in this region and then the new way of life. Next up, from BlueMoonKissLove, we have a very blue architectural photo. I read the notes in the email. I think this was taken on one of the Lomo blue on a lomography film, if I remember correctly. There were so many entries and so many notes to read. I apologize if I'm misremembering that. So anyway, there's a number of things here that are going really well. The verticals are vertical, or pretty darn close for a handheld photo. And also the structure of the image shows the canyon shape of the city street. Like, you can see it curving around to the side, and you can tell that it's going to go somewhere, but it's blocked by this parking garage on the left side. And so that adds a lot of depth and a lot of visual interest. And then that central building is entirely in frame. It's not cut off on either side. So we know that that is the subject of the photo. And to that end, and then also the focus, good focus from front to back. There's, some of the bollards up front, a little bit soft. That's okay. That's just a factor of depth of field, and there's a limitation to that. That's not a problem per se. So overall, from a technical perspective, really solid work. If we could imagine cropping this photo, let's say that you cropped it you've got this lamppost here that's close up, the one that's a little bit blurry, right? If you imagine cropping the photo just underneath that lamppost, so you get the very top of the bollard, or not, play around with it, then you would lose this sidewalk in the bottom fifth of the photo, because that's not doing anything for your image. So if you cut that out, then you'd lose a bit of useless negative space. And then that would give your building more of the image space, so it would make it more dominant within that. The other thing you could do instead of that, if you felt comfortable or safe doing this, you've got those two bollards that are before the grate. Imagine standing on, say, either those two bollards and straddling them, or that front bollard and that grate. You'd have functionally the same perspective, but you'd move yourself to crop out the sidewalk that you're standing at the back of, and then you'd by doing that, make the building you're taking a photo of more of the photo, because it would take up more of the image. The risk there is you could end up with some keystoning, so you'd have to work around that. But if you don't, those are a couple of different ways to think about the reframing of that. So, other than that, from a technical perspective, there's a lot of checks, a lot of boxes in this that are checked correctly, and well done on that. And our next photo comes from Brian Calvert, and this is an interesting entry in this category because it's the only photo that is obviously taken from the top of another building. If we think back 30 seconds to the blue photo, imagine retaking that photo of the building that was taking the entire frame up from the top of that parking garage with an ultra-wide angle lens. Wouldn't have to worry about converging verticals anymore. That's what Brian's done here. He had access to a construction site and was able to get a photo of this nighttime skyline of this city. At any rate, and one of the things about night photography is how fantastic the colors are. They're just, because of the longer exposure, you end up with richer and more saturated colors, also because they're darker, and people perceive darker colors as being richer and more saturated. So nighttime photography is really nice, and you also, at night with a city, get the lights of the cityscape buildings, which this might be the only, there's one other. one other photo in this category that does that I can think of off the top of my head. So at any rate, that's, I think, a really good instinct to take a photo in this setting at this time of night. So what could we imagine a little bit differently here? I think by and large, the foreground is the only thing, is the thing that's the distracting element. So if you imagine cropping off everything from that dark wall where the trees are horizontally, and then cropping that off, you could or could not, up to you, leave the green structure. It does make more sense to have this, what I'm assuming is a crane leg, or crane structure here, showing that this is a construction site. But if you cropped out the construction work and cropped out that crane, you'd end up with like this, the trees at the bottom, and then the skyline. You'd have a bit more of a traditional skyline photo, and you would lose a little bit of the construction scene setting. So 6 one way, half dozen the other on that. I do like that this photo shows the construction scene as well, because this is not a setting that most people will get to see or take photos of in their life. Next up, from Casey Schmidt, we have an architectural photo of boathouses. And so as we talked about with many of these, technical aspects, really well done. Verticals are vertical, horizontals are horizontal, really good. That's one of the things a lot of people, when they take photos of, don't necessarily get right. So it's good to be mindful of them. And then the physical location of the photo here, with the foreground having a bit of reflection, and the also the camera being on level with just above the roof line of the boathouses, is really good, because it makes full use of your lens. So, if you imagine your lens, the center of your lens is at the center of your image, right? I know that's like a silly thing to say, but it's kind of also an aha moment, because if you have the center of your lens at the center of your image, and you have then the center of the lens pointed at the bottom of something, well, then everything below that is not going to be the best use of space. So what Casey's done here is he's lined up the center of the lens and the image with the roof lines, so that you capture the full side of the boathouses, a bit of the foreground of the water, as well as the hills in the background. So you have a really good sense of setting, as well as having all of the technical aspects done correctly. When you have the camera horizontal for architecture, you have a much better chance of getting those technical aspects correct, because you don't have converging or diverging lines. A couple of other things that are going on really well here are the use of color. And if you look at the boathouses on the right, you've got the yellow and the red one, and their reflections really pop, especially since everything else is kind of like a muted white, purple, gray. So they really stand out. So what could we play what if with this photo if we were going to do that? Imagine, if it's possible, scooting over to the right, and then having that aisle of boathouses that are on the right be the center of the frame, instead of the post on this walkway, right? And if you did that, then that would make the color of those two boathouses more dominant in the image. Then the other thing to think about is, imagine having your tripod, and either doing this a little bit earlier in the morning when there's less light, or having a neutral density filter, or doing this in this setting during the day with a really good neutral density filter, or with a digital camera and doing a series of photos and then merging them, blending them together in post to get the water so that it's smoother. And that would make the reflections a little bit less watery, if that makes any sense. You can see where the reflections are showing the ripples of the water. Or even just moving to the right in this exact same lighting would really emphasize that color as well. This is a good way to show that the use of color in certain settings can be really important. And if the color of those two buildings had been more dominant in the photo, I think that would really have made those two buildings pop and emphasized the importance of color in the setting as well. Next up, from Emma Bockelmann, We have a photo of, I think she said this was a train station with a group of pigeons, company of pigeons. I forget the name for flock for these, if there is one, at the top of the photos, at the top of the building, rather. So really like the use of shape here. You have a mixture of straight lines and curved lines. The verticals are a little bit off. You can see down here on the right side that brick wall is bending in, and some of the verticals in the little bit closer to the center are bending in a little bit. It's hard to tell, but they are. So the camera's clearly pointed upward, kind of hard not to be for this photo. But the instinct to show the shape of the building and how all of the shapes are kind of working together, I think is a really good one. So if I were to look at recomposing this image, think about tilting the camera down. So, because right now, the top half of the photo is sky, and it's not really doing a whole lot for this image. So if you tilted the camera down and say had the top of the photo be just a little bit above the spire in that building, now you would have a bunch of this dark area, this alcove, that's currently a bit cropped. Now, that might be like kind of just, who knows what's in there. Might not be photogenic, but that's okay because it's dark and shadowed, and you can always darken it either with your print by really burning in that area, or in post by kind of cloning and darkening that area, and then you'll preserve that darkness at the cost of whatever details you don't want to have in there anyway. And then that would emphasize the shape and the interplay of shapes within the building as well. So there's a lot of good instinct in here, and just a matter of tilting the camera in a different angle. I think we're about to see our first interior architectural shot from Frank Wouters, and this is a really nice interior detail of beams. So like, as somebody who's worked in construction engineering firms for most of my career, I look at engineering structures differently than I think a lot of people do. And I really enjoy the way that this structure is built. From a photographic standpoint, like, there's some really cool use of shape here. We're not just talking about straight lines. There's triangles, squares, rectangles. There's the roundness of the tubes and the lamps, the light fixtures. All the verticals are vertical. You've got converging lines. So I think it's a good photo in terms of the study of the shape of an interior architectural space. So the use of light also really good. The exposure here is spot on. And when you're taking a photo of an interior space that is lit by daylight in what it looks like full sun, that can be really hard to get correct. So from a technical standpoint, really nailed this pretty darn well. So yeah, I think that's good. Our next photo comes from Jaeyon Lee, and this is a nice take on architecture. As I have gotten older, I have become more of a fan of this type of architectural photo where it's, I don't know the name of the genre. I just call it flat because it doesn't have any depth, right? It's a storefront basically, and it's something that could be recreated as like a pretty simple vector image, right? If you take just the green storefront, it could be a pretty simple vector image, and that would be very flat. Anyway, so good use. So what this photo is doing right, again, as we've talked about, verticals are vertical. Like, you guys really were very consistent across all of the entries for having nice and vertical verticals. The use of color here, and I think especially like the green next to the pink to the blue, and because of the film used here, it's kind of a little bit muted pastel-y, and I think that's kind of neat. Because these are actual storefronts, the text on them doesn't really bother me that much because it is part of the subject. Let's think about a revision to this photo. What could we do a little bit differently here? Imagine turning the camera portrait orientation. So that would crop out the trash can on the right, By the way, trash cans and photos, huge pet peeve. It's just me. I'm weird that way. We're going to talk about that during the portfolio review episode and the lengths that I go to fix that. But if you just turn the camera portrait, then that trash can would be gone. So would the parking sign, which the text of that does not contribute anything. You would lose a little bit of the fashion nail and spa sign. So I'm not entirely sure how I would tackle that in this setting, if there was a way to or not. But you would also crop out the front of this car over here on the left. What you would gain from that would be more of the tree. And also the green building would take up more of the overall photo. So you would end up with that being a more dominant part of the photo, because right now the building on the left actually takes up more of your photo space than the green building. And I think arguably you could even say the nail and spa might take up a hair more. I do like how the photo shows how crammed in there the green building is. The other thing that I would think about, if it's possible, I don't know what was behind you, but if there was like the steps of, like you've got the brick steps over here of the building on the left, if there was something like that, or a bench, if you were just standing on the sidewalk, if there's a way to get a little bit higher, then you would, if you turned the camera portrait, you'd get a bunch more of the street. Not going to be a good look. Street kind of just boring. But if you stood up a little bit, or especially if you had a way, I know this is a film photo, but if you had a way to hold the camera a little bit above you, then you would lift the camera and get more of the top of the tree and less of the sidewalk in that setting. So I do think the instinct to photograph this building is a good one, because it's an interesting building. The color's really neat. It stands out as being different from the rest of them, of the other two rather, because it's a bit more worn down. So I think there's a lot of things going right here, and overall a fairly successful photo. Next up, from Joseph Schallmo, we have an old mine. This, do I recognize that building? I don't think so. This looks very Independence, Alaska-y, although this isn't one of the buildings up there. Anyway, mine photography is a ton of fun. Like, as a Coloradan, well, I should say, as someone who lives in Colorado, I haven't lived here long enough to call myself a Coloradan. As someone who lives in Colorado, I love photographing mine buildings, and they are just always perennially great subjects, even ones like this, which are relatively new. So there's a really good use of color in this, because everything's a little bit muted, right? Mine photography often is a little bit muted, but we have this rusty red piece of equipment up at the front, and then we have that color reflected in the door of the window coverings of these buildings in back, and also the frames around the mine building windows, and the bricks and stone of those buildings, and a bit in the vegetation, and a bit, of course, in the rust of the structure in front of the mine building. And then everything else is green and gray. So this is a photo that, honestly, as a black and white photo, could turn out pretty well. And also, as a color photo, really does work very well. Also, it's one of those photos that can do both very nicely. Very few things here I would say to do a ton differently. Quite frankly, I guess one of the things I would say is the left fifth of your photo is not doing anything. So if you imagine cutting this down to 4x5 or 1x1, and seeing how a different crop here, if you would change the relationship of the building to the overall percentage of the photo that it takes. You could crop out some of this left side here that doesn't add anything. You could crop out some of these towers on the right side here that aren't really adding anything either. And then have this smaller brick building be close to the edge of the frame. And then also the bigger brick building close to the other edge, or the wheels at the other edge. And I think that would also kind of change the dominance of this building in that photo. So just something to think about and play with this photo. Next up, from Joshua Gaude, we have a photo of a very dangerous waterway. So these look like locks, I'm guessing,
locks into spillway. And yeah, I'm going to guess that is probably pretty dangerous. I love the fact, by the way, this is something that this is something a lot of, no one else, maybe no one else did. If you look at the very bottom of the photo, there's someone fishing there. That tells you exactly how big this thing is. When you're taking an architectural photo, if you look at professional architectural photos, a lot of them have people in them. And usually it's somebody it's a long exposure, and it's somebody who's moving, so they're nice and blurry. But the person isn't important. The sense of scale of the person in relationship to the space is what the person is doing there. And that's what this person is doing here. Yes, of course, absolutely, they're fishing. But what they are really doing is showing that those cement blocks that make up these locks are gigantic. Okay? Yeah, sure, the walkway at the top, at the locks could tell us that too, but that's a detail that would be easily missed, much more so than the person. So I think that's a really good instinct to include the person in the photo. Other than that, there's good use of tone, contrast. There's some shadow clipping, some highlight clipping, not the end of the world for this photo, because this is an industrial space. And industrial space photos tend to benefit from being a bit more gritty and a bit harsher a lot of the time, because it conveys a sense of space. So I think that those elements of this photo really do work pretty well. Our next subject, and sticking with the industrial vein, sticking with the mining vein, comes from Ken Andersson. And this is an old structure of some sort in the middle of a pile of rubble. So best guess, this is probably another mining structure of some kind, probably like a bridge structure, a bridge footing of some kind. I think this is a really neat photo because this smooth concrete structure is coming out of this really textured rubble. It's a very good use of texture and smoothness next to each other. Of course, then the age of this thing is pretty apparent by the trees growing around it. Those probably wouldn't have been when it was built, especially given that looks like the ruins of an old mine truck road. Definitely would not have been trees there then. And then the way that the sky works in this really well, because the sky has become an element in this because it is both inside and outside of this frame. And the cirrus clouds that are in the sky are visible. And on a lot of film photos, that's not the case. So I couldn't tell you, I'm going to guess that there was some filtration here, maybe probably a yellow filter. I don't think this looks quite like an orange filter. The trees just aren't dark enough for that. But really, overall, the tonal balance in this for a harsh light daylight photo is really executed exceptionally well. Our next photo comes from Luise Blaesi, and this is an upward angled architectural photo. There's something really interesting going on here with this photo. The right side, everything is lit by this warm orange light. And then on the left, everything is these cool blue LEDs. So you've got this split of color. But you've got more than that, because the building on the right, which is orange, is also an old building with old architecture. And the buildings on the left are brand new. So this photo is a really interesting take on color and age. And it's using the angle and that color and the overall structure here to emphasize the difference in the buildings between the old one and the new ones. I think that's a really good eye and a really good instinct to do that. The only thing I would think of here is it is dramatically upward, which from a traditional architectural standpoint, not really something that is looked at as a part of the best practices for architecture. So if we imagine tilting the camera down a little bit so that that light that's at the top of the frame comes out of the frame, you'd still have the glare and you'd still have the colors from it, but then you'd have a less dramatic upward angle. But I mean, one of the other things I also wanted to point out here is how good the depth of field is on this.
The brick column, or the concrete limestone column in the very foreground, you can see the texture on it, and you can also see the detail in the very far building's window structure. So really nice, also, by the way, really nice use of long exposure. Most architectural photos are long exposure photos, and this does that and uses exposure and depth of field very nicely to get in an image which has got detail from front to back. So overall, lot of good instinct here. My only quibble being that I have a personal preference for architectural photos which are not pointing the camera upward. Next up, from Milan Cetic, we have an architectural photo of gravestones. And this one, I'm sort of like, does it meet the prompt of architectural photos? And we'll talk about this again with a later photo. Is this an architectural subject, or is it a monument photo? I would argue that this is not an architectural photo, because in the strictest sense, architectural photos are interior and exterior shots of buildings or structures that were used for purposes like that. I would extend architectural photos to include bridges. I think obviously because there is the work of architects that go into them. So I guess maybe that's a good definition. An architectural photo is a photo of work that has an architect's influence in the design and development stage. And I think that's probably a fair way to approach it. So I think in that regard, this photo doesn't meet the prompt. What I think really is going nicely with this photo, this is a great exposure. This is a hard situation to get a good exposure of. You have the gray of the monuments, and then you have a very bright sky and some very dark shadows. So really tricky lighting setup to begin with, especially for a film photographer. The next thing to look at here is the use of texture. There is texture all through this photo. You've got the different textures in the ages of the monuments and how worn they are or how weathered. Different texture from where they do and don't have lichen growth on them. And also the different texture of the iron fencing and then the background. And so from a look at how to pair textures together, this is really executing that really well. And the other thing that's executing really well is tone. And I think part of this for me, because I can't read the lettering on it, the lettering isn't distracting. It just becomes a bunch of shapes that are really well emphasized because of how dark they are by either lichens or dirt that has found its way into those recesses, compared to the relatively even coloration of the rest of the base of the monuments. So really good use of tone as well as texture here. So this next photo of this house comes from Richard Mengle. I think this is an interesting take on architecture. I think houses tend to kind of get ignored, like especially, typical everyday houses tend to get ignored a lot in architectural photography. And I think that's kind of unfortunate, because this is where most of us spend our lives. Are they flashy? No. Do they have to be? No. They can still lend themselves to really interesting photos. And one of the things that makes this photo is the reflection. The other one is the bridge that's in front of it. So the house is a little bit out of focus, so I'm going to actually argue that the bridge is intended to be the subject of the photo here. And in that case, it kind of disappears into the background because the shape of the bridge is so much in line with the shape of the shoreline. But what I really like is how the bridge separates the house from its reflection. So from the perspective of getting everything aligned here and framed well, that's done really nicely. And I think there's a lot of things that are going on really well with that structure. I also like the subject of the bridge as the subject of the photo. So two things to think about here. One would be, imagine cropping here, actually more than two. Imagine cropping here on the left, right? So that you cropped somewhere in these tall, I forget what that type of tree is called, over there, so that the edge of the bridge wouldn't be as dominant. Or you could crop right at that vertical post or just on the inside of it. And then that would take out a little bit of the left side, which isn't getting, isn't doing too much for the image. Same is true over on this right side. You could crop in a little bit there and make the image just a little bit tighter. And I think really a 5:7 aspect ratio for this image would work really well. The other thing to think about would be these bobbers, because they are so much different, just hitting them with a clone out brush and seeing how that works for the photo. The other thing to think about as a potentiality for this is going back to this bridge. And so one of the photo assignments in my Photo 101 course from a couple of years ago was do 36 photos of the same subject. So think about this bridge as a photo subject for multiple angles. What would it look like a little bit closer down to the shore? What would it look like on the bridge? Things like that. If you were to go back and to pick an arbitrary number, 20 completely different photos of this bridge, how would that affect the way that you are forced to then frame it? So I do really like, by the way, how, like I said, the overall image structure here with the way that the bridge splits up the house and the reflection. I think that's a really good eye. And I'm not sure that I would have picked up on that just walking past this. So kudos on that. Our next photo comes from Rich Mander, and we have another upward tilting architectural photo. And it does capture the details really well. The depth of field is, for a nighttime photo like this, is really good, which is kind of surprising given that the motion of the people is like mostly not blurred, right? So this is an example of how we talked about earlier with the person showing the scale. Like the people here really do show the scale of these buildings, and it's a good eye to include people in your architectural photos when possible. So especially when they contribute to it in something like this. So the other thing is like the use of color here. You've got a lot of different colors. The cool whites of the LEDs inside the buildings, the nice blue of the sky, the warm tones of the lights down at the dining area level. Just a really nice, and then of course the dark tones of the buildings themselves and the reflection on the left, and just a really nice use of color. The texture is there as well, and the vertical, and the definition of the lines. So let's think about a couple of things that could be revisions to this shot. The first one is that you've got your verticals, like the building on the left looks like it's about to fall over. So it'd be interesting to see like if you kind of split the difference between making that building's edge perfectly vertical and the building on the right look like it's falling over, like how would that affect the photo? Part of that's just a matter of angle because you weren't centered on the walkway between them. You were coming at it from an angle. They're never going to be perfectly vertical with a photo taken from this perspective. The other thing would be to look at the bottom of this. And you've got the seating area here with some like last year's plants. Imagine taking the crop line halfway between these people's feet and that seating area right across the bottom. You would lose a lot of negative space, and that's not doing anything for your photo right now. It would emphasize more the buildings, and then it would put the people more at the bottom of the photo, which would be sort of a natural placement given that they're walking next to the bottom of a building. And the only other thing I could think of would be this: if you have if you're using a camera that has aperture control, stop it down a couple more stops, because right now your stars don't have any star points. And one of the things we'll see in a later photo, I forget exactly, I think it's later, near the very end of this video, is the way that star points around source point lights in a nighttime photograph really emphasize the lights and really add a nice element to those images. So those would be just a couple of things to think about as a revision. But in terms of like your eye for color here, really spot on. Yeah, really like the way that was done. Our next photo comes from Robert Thompson. And this was a photo I loved. So we'll jump right into what are a couple of things that we could do differently, because there's a lot of things that are going right here. Imagine cropping this photo just a little bit
so that that lamppost is a little bit cut off. Like if you got that bead around the building, imagine cropping it there. Grabbing your cloning brush and taking out this VPI sticker on the bottom right photo. Okay, really relatively minor stuff. There's a little bit of pincushion distortion on the right side of the building, and then you can kind of see that the camera was a little bit tilted by the angles in the windows. So just a couple of honestly pretty darn insignificant technical things that could just be down to a hand jitter at the moment of the capture. So I really like the instinct to grab this detail shot of this building because there's a lot of different really good black and white photography stuff going on here. We've got texture, the brick, right, and the glass, smooth and textured right next to each other. We've got tones in the shadowed or maybe lichen covered brick at the bottom versus the brighter sun-bleached brick up above it, and the darkness of the windows. It's a really nice use of tone. There's no like blown out bright white highlights. So this is a really, in terms of like the zone system, really constrained to the middle range of tones and getting rid of those areas that sort of blow out and clip the highlights and shadows. Also, really good instinct for black and white photography. Then the windows, like there's some that are open and some that are closed. So that last point is, I think, one of the really strong suits of this photo, is that it's doing all of these two things, these opposites together, the key of which is order and chaos. All of the windows are in lines. They're in a grid. The bricks are ordered and put together in the same way. And then the windows are in different alignments and different amounts of open and close. And so they add this hint of chaos to what is otherwise a very well-ordered system. And so this one little detail shot here just tells us a whole lot about the setting that this building is in, and it does a good job of doing exactly that. Next up, from Stephen Boyce, we have a photo of a cube sculpture. And when we talked about the monuments a few photos ago, I asked anyway, is this an architectural photo? So is this an architecture photo, or is it a sculpture photo? Is it a public art photo? I'm going to say it's the latter. Yes, we have the buildings in the background, but they're not the subject. The subject is the sculpture. So we know that's a sculptural photo of a sculpture. Okay. One of the things I really like about the way this is done is not only was this a film photo, you can tell by the grain in the image, this was a like really analog film photo. And you can see that there's a few little mistakes. We've got the vertical banding here. You've got what looks like a little bit of rinse water drip that didn't, in the bottom right corner, that didn't quite make it off. And so that texture and that little bit of imperfection in the image sets itself apart and complements the smoothness, and we could argue the perfection of the sculpture that the photo is of. The sculpture itself also has some stickers and some blemishes on it, bird poo or whatever that is up at the top, that kind of rob it of that smoothness, and that's okay because they make it feel more like it's part of the photo. So one thing that is worth looking at here is the background, because you have this the center of the photo subject, and then the background is just very there, and then the sculpture cuts off a lot of the background, so it looks like it's kind of growing out of the sculpture, and I'm not sold that that's an intentional design choice or an intentional compositional choice. So I'd be curious to find out, what would this look like from the other angles? Another thing to think about, we talked about earlier the bridge photo. What if you went back and took 20 photos of this? What if you went back with a roll of film and burned up that entire roll of film on this sculpture? What would you get out of this sculpture that you're not getting right now?
Because, okay, you could go out and you could start off there with, you've got 4 sides to the sculpture. And you could take a photo from each of those 4 sides. We've still got 32 photos left to take. What else are you going to do with them? So imagine revising this photo subject to take photos of the individual shapes that talk about the subject. So let's just take a look at this side right here, this kind of facing us in shadow. It's got a circular entry, and then it's got this channel that goes down diagonally to it, and then sort of another one that goes to it, meeting at that circular entry. What would happen if you had some detail shots of places where those different shapes and angles meet, especially if you have different lighting and different tones within those spaces? Like, how would that work? So this would be another place where, if you have the opportunity to go back to this and do an entire roll on this, I think that would change your photographic relationship with this subject and open up some new ways of thinking about how to photograph a subject. How could you capture a detail element of a photo that would talk about the nature of the whole? You'd be forced to do that if you had to take tons and tons of photos of this thing. So anyway, just a thought on a way to potentially revise this photo. Next up, from Stephen Boesky, we have a photo of, I feel like you submitted a photo of this church last year. Am I misremembering, or did somebody else? This church looks really familiar. Anyway, I recall critiquing this church before, and I'm going to say pretty much the same thing I think I said before, that post is blocking part of the window on the right side and it drives me nuts. Pretty sure I said that last year too. That's all right, because there's so much about this photo that's going. So how would we fix that? You'd need more even lighting, and then you'd want to clone the window on the left into the window on the right. And why am I saying that's okay? We'll talk about that at the portfolio photo video when I go after my own architectural photo and talk about some of the things I did there. Anyway, back to this one. So the only real way you could do that would be to clone out the window that's blocked and then just let the tone of the vertical post blend into the tree. Again, you could probably clone out that post that's in the tree and the fence without great difficulty. Anyway, let's talk about what's really going right here. This is from the perspective of a traditional, like best practices, classic type of architectural photo, ticking basically every box you can tick from the perspective that this photo was taken from. It would be very easy with this photo to have those 2 bell towers look like they're going to fall into each other. And this controls that exceptionally well. So I couldn't tell you if it's done in post through keystone correction or if it was done with camera angle. It doesn't look like it was done with camera movement. Like, I don't think this was a sheet film camera or a perspective control lens, simply because the light loss associated with that isn't exhibited here. So I'm gonna guess that this is a crop of a slightly larger photo and that the camera was held level. And with a high enough resolution sensor, there's no reason that would be an issue. At any rate, so the verticals are really vertical. The angle on this is also really noteworthy because you get the side of the building and that gives it some depth. It's not just a straight on. And we talked about having the flat one before, and I do really like that style. When talking about traditional architectural photography, this is pretty darn close to the type of angle that would, that type of photography would look for. And then the other thing we have is really not vibrant colors, but very present colors and a nice mixture. Yeah, we have the blue of the sky, which is kind of pale blue, and we have the greens, which are pretty vibrant of themselves. And then the brickwork is a really nice ruddy color of brick, really pops, like it's in the middle of the photo, and it's set against all of these other fairly muted colors except the trees, and it pops. The red really stands out. So really good use of the technical aspects of architectural photography. They are ticked off really nice here, all those boxes, and really good use of color. This was so close to being one of the honorable mentions because it just executed this prompt really beautifully. This next photo is of, I think, the New Bay Bridge in San Francisco. It looks like it. At any rate, really interesting take on this prompt. I think this is, there might be one other silhouette-ish photo here, pseudo, but this is the only one that I think uses the silhouette as the subject of the image. And it really does a good job of highlighting what is a very pleasant shape of the bridge. You've got some the verticals there have that nice diamond pattern to it, and then these suspension cables coming out of it, really nice and symmetrical. And so the use of the silhouette here against the colors of the sunset, really absolutely lovely use of a silhouette. Well, contre-jour type of photo. So because it's not a pure silhouette, because you still have detail in the thing that is in it. You can see some of the understructure of the bridge, some detail in the rocks and the water below it. So this is a contre-jour, not a silhouette. Anyway, those are hard photos to get and to do well. And so this does that very well. And it makes the shape really dominate what is otherwise a color space. So I think that's really well done. The only distracting element in this are the Oakland cranes over there. And that's the sort of thing that a clone out brush could get rid of in a few seconds. And but other than that, like, yeah, really well executed bridge photo. Oh, I forgot to mention, that one comes from Trevor Duff. And yeah, this next photo comes from Wayne. And it's a photo of what looks like a multi-unit residential structure that's some number of years old. Like, sort of has that like 60s, 70s, maybe into the 80s Rust Belt type of architectural sensibility. So, generally speaking, the framing of the image itself works pretty well. There are some distracting elements. I do think, by the way, most of what I would say would be distracting elements contribute a lot to the atmosphere of the space. You've got the satellite dish and the barbecue pit and this overgrown grass. Those aren't distracting elements because they're telling a story about the space and the way that it's being upkept, okay? Then you've got the tree that's growing right next to the building. Not necessarily a good idea to have a tree that close to the building, so that tells you a lot about the attention that the landscape is getting as well. Then we have in the very foreground, we have this little bit of sidewalk with some overgrowth on it, and then some trees up at the very top, and those are doing the same thing, which is giving sort of, they're binding the photo because there's no like clean edge at the end, and they're also giving this sense of chaos to the photo as well, chaos and unkemptness. The only distracting element that I would call out here, there's literally nothing you can do about it whatsoever, is the mesh fence. Just because it breaks up the, it does separate that backyard from the grass outside of it. It's just, it is such a dominant aspect of the photo that it just sort of runs roughshod over the rest of the image. So yeah, that'd be my key observation with that. Other than that, I do think it's also a good instinct to structure the image this way and to go after this type of subject, because again, this is not the type of subject that most people go out of their way to do an architectural photo of. Next up, from Yohan Beeri, we have a photo which is an interesting entry into this competition because this is a silhouette, but the silhouette's not the point of the photo. The silhouette adds form and space to the place that the photo is taken, which is inside of a larger structure, looking out at what I assume is like a courtyard for some other buildings. So what's going on here is, imagine this photo without this structure that's in the front of it. It'd be kind of boring. That structure, because of its darkness, frames the overall photo. it creates this triangle, these two or multiple triangles really, but this one main dominant triangle that pens in the viewer's eyes to the buildings that the photo is being taken of. And that's a really good use of framing in scene to keep the viewer's eyes in the subject. And then of course you've got the frames along the bottom which do a very similar thing. So I do like the use of silhouette in this photo and the way that the bottom of the framing timbers of this roof structure are a little bit illuminated, but then it becomes very dark really quickly. One image presentation note: generally speaking, white borders around your photos like this one has don't add to the image. So if you can imagine this photo without the white border, where you are now placed into the scene with nothing telling you, I mean, you know it's a photo, but there is nothing visual within the scene telling you that it's a photo, then what the frame does in this is kind of force the viewer to be taken out of the photo as a photo for a little bit. Frames like this were used in prints when they were going to be matted, because then the matting wouldn't cover up any of the image. So just a thing to think about, what would this look like without the white border around the outside of it? And that is it. Next up, we're going to go to the honorable mentions. And we're going to start with this honorable mention from Avery Wag. So this is a really stunningly good use of black and white for an architectural photo, and really a good traditional composition in an architectural photo as well. There's also really, of all the photos we saw with water, this is one of two, we haven't gotten to the second one yet, where the water is still. And that's created a very good reflection of the build, like a perfect reflection of the building. This is actually the only photo where in this category that has a perfect reflection of the building in the water. I looked at this and I was just like, yeah, I kind of wish I'd taken that photo, because this, like, from a technical perspective, great. Everything's done correctly. Wonderful. And then, so what it comes down to is the use of tone and contrast. And the way that this image is structured then is your eyes naturally follow the building towards this white light, this white area, which is also going to attract your eyes to it. And then from that, it's kind of easy to start going around and appreciating the rest of the image. So this is just every element of this photo that was done very, very well across the board. Here we have our next honorable mention from Clay Williams. And, you know, my knee-jerk was, is that the Sydney? I don't think that's the Sydney Opera Hall. Anyway, this is an image that combines tone, texture, shape, and lines in an absolutely wonderful manner. The curves serve to draw your eyes toward the center of the frame. They sort of prevent your eyes from leaving it. The darkness of the entry on the right side, the sky on the left, also serve to kind of keep your eyes focused on the nature of the shape of the face of this big curving structure that we can see, which is in the left half of the photo. And then we've got the lines on the bottom of the steps. And those are also, they give a nice foreground to the image, and they also set themselves apart from the rest of the structure, which is by and large, except for the zigzags, using curved lines throughout. So they set up a difference between all of these curves and the straightness of those lines. And then because they're a uniform-ish, generally uniform tone, there are some shadows in there, you have this uniform gray block right underneath these two dark triangles. And then beyond those, back to uniform gray. So a really nice marrying of many of the key elements that make black and white photography a unique art form unto itself. And our last honorable mention is an interior photo from Luca Paisani. And this is one of, I think there were only two
Yeah, only 2 interior architectural photos for the whole category. We haven't seen the other one yet. Curious about that. I wonder where it's going to place. So anyway, what we've got here is a really cool use of shape. And we've talked about this, by the way, with the last 2 photos. Really cool use of shape, tone, contrast, texture, and all of that. Would hammer that home again. The only thing I would look at with this is if you could go back and take this photo again. Imagine tilting your camera slightly to the right, and so that the right side of the oval wasn't clipped off, and then the left side of the oval ended at that side of the frame. Then the oval, the shape of the oval, would divide this photo into like 5 different layers. And there would be clear dividing lines. There'd be this strong oval shape in the middle, this grid pattern in the foreground, both on the roof and the ceiling, more grids with all the vertical lines going away down the center of this mall. So I think the instinct for this framing and the subject and the structure and this location was on point. The only quibble would be tilt the camera slightly to the right. Another thing to think about with this, by the way, if you can go back when it's, say, darker at night and all these lights are still out and turned on, that would be an interesting, if those lights ever do get turned on, would be an interesting way to light the scene from within and add some lighting dynamism to the structure of the image. So we'll go now to our second place photo, and this comes from McCool, and it is our other interior photo. So we talked about having white frames around your photos before. This, I'm kind of torn. I think the white frame maybe adds a bit. I'd be interested to see what this looks like without. And the reason I think this white frame kind of adds a little bit is it looks like this is a page out of an architectural magazine, like a classic architectural magazine. This is a photo which is in the vein of traditional 60s, 70s, 80s color film interior architectural photography. And it's just a really great use of like a perfectly level camera, first off, and a nice wide enough angle that looks both down and up at the same time. You capture a lot of different tones and shadows. There's some really neat use of color here, lots of reds, creams, and greens with a hint of blue and the white sky up above. The lighting is just really well done and well captured. You can get a sense that the top floor is really bright, and then the darker floors, they keep getting darker and darker, and there's less natural lighting reaching them. Just the overall structure of the way that these lines come out from the side of the photo and converge in the center is really just a lovely image structure. This is a kind of photo that I would expect to see reading a textbook from the 70s or 80s about how to take an interior architectural photo. And our last and first place, it's going to seem confusing because there are 2 of you sitting out there right now saying, wait a minute, I haven't seen my name. And what we're going to do is for the first time ever, I am going to do, I think this is the first time I've ever said there are 2 first place photos because I could not pick which one I liked best. We're going to start here with Jamista's Cityscape of Pittsburgh. It's Pittsburgh. Let's move on. Just kidding. So this is like a classic. So this is a classic black and white cityscape photo. Like if it were like the mid 40s or 50s and I were on vacation in Pittsburgh looking for a postcard to send home to my family, this is what kind of photo I would expect to see on it. That's pretty high praise, especially, considering that people who were doing those photos back then were really pretty good. This is super well structured. You have 2 of the 3 rivers right there. A lot of the bridges, the bridges are converging on downtown. The rivers are diverging from downtown, but you have the shape of the peninsula, which is like this triangular shape, and it's hemmed in by the sky, by the horizon line in the background. And all of those elements together combine to keep the viewer's eyes focused on the city skyline. And this is,
we just talked about this with the interior shot. If someone said, hey, here's a vintage book on how to take a proper city skyline photo, this is one of the photos I would expect to see as this type of photo, a photo structured like this from this perspective, in that as an example of how a city skyline photo should be taken. So, well done. The only thing I think of, if you wanted to try and take this photo from this perspective again, what would this look like at night? Yeah, I think that would be an interesting question. What would this look like with those buildings lit up from the inside, especially in color? So just a thing to think about if you were ever in this at this location again. And for our second first place, we have from Antonio King. Yeah, that's a darn good shot. So we talked about having star points with number of shots ago, and that's going on with the lights in this photo, especially down there along the waterline where there's an individual source point light. You have the aperture blade stars, and the only thing that's really like thrown me with this photo is down here in the reflection of the central building. I can't tell what those reflections are. It looks like it's just stuff in the water that's moving around the light. Not sure if I would have cloned those out. I actually spent about half an hour last night looking at this photo going, would I have cloned those out? And not arriving at any kind of answer. This is a photo that if I took it, it would absolutely have been in my top, definitely 20, probably 10 of the year. This is a really well done photo. And so the structure of this, all the verticals and all of it being really strong, the use of tone, this is a nice long exposure. You get a little bit of cloud motion in it. And so clearly a nighttime photo, which is what you need to get this kind of cloud motion and this long of an exposure with a small aperture. Like the structure, the clarity across it is really good. There are some interesting things like to talk about with, I think, the lens here. And as I've done the round glass review videos, I kind of have started looking more for these things. So first, I was curious about what lens this was, and I had a guess. I was very close. When I looked at this, I thought, this looks like it's probably a 24 to 70 millimeter zoom lens. I wasn't exactly sure which one it was at first, so I looked at the EXIF data to see if it was in there, and it was not. It did confirm my suspicion because it's 41 millimeter focal length f2.9 for the wide open, which indicates an effective f2.9, which means it's a 24 to 70 f2.8. And so this is a Sony photo, which means it's and then the apertures, the stars are 18 pointed with a circular coma, a circular blur around the source point, which means nine-bladed aperture with rounded blades. It's the 24 to 70 f2.8 G Master lens. Also has a little bit of field curvature where the buildings on the outside are that kind of appears in some situations. So anyway, this is, by the way, I do this with almost all of your photos. When I look at these, I'm like, how did they do that? Because it helps me to study these photos and see how other people are doing it. So looking at this, I think it's a really good use of that focal length. It's 41 millimeter focal length, slightly wider than normal, but you still get a little bit more of the scene, but you don't get that wide angle distortion that you would if this were zoomed all the way out to 24 millimeters. So this is one of those cases where architectural photography doesn't have to have like a 20 millimeter or something like that lens, especially with cityscapes. And when you are far away from your subject like this and can use a narrower focal length, it can do a lot to make your subject and your cityscape in this sense look way more natural. And so the instinct to zoom in a little bit, use this crop, and to have a nice deep depth of field with a very small aperture to smoothen out the water, capture the motion in these clouds, have a nice even illumination across the scene, and get really lovely, absolutely lovely star points from those lamps along the waterline. Everything in this photo really worked very, very well. So
Well done. You guys really hit the architectural, hit an architectural home run this year. Wonderful, wonderful work in this category across the board.